We were friends, Chris, Arthur, Joff, Big, and I. I guess you could say we were naughty boys. If you were to describe the dreams of another 10-year-old, I could show you how we were not so different. It was Arthur's dare, but then that is how it would happen. Arthur would dare, Chris would lead, Big would follow bravely, and Joff would follow nervously. I would follow. I'd always wonder why. Big was enamored by ants. He had a glass-fronted thin cabinet that profiled a nest. He would feed the ants by opening the top of the cabinet and leaving tidbits of sweets, including sugar or honey. An older boy had seized Big's ants. At his mercy, the ants did what they normally do, hurrying and scurrying and attending to the nest of the queen. The soldiers soon mobilized, but they were helpless. No more tasty tidbits for them. Soon, a few were relocated to an established home for daddy long-legged spiders, eventually to be consumed by the spiders. Most were caught and held helpless in webs. The rest were drowned in an acid bath of urine. When Big ran to Chris to tell him about the older bully, Chris had been playing a CD for Arthur. Arthur was attempting to copy the tune on a guitar. Joff was there too. I wanted to show Chris a story I'd read, and I was waiting for a natural break in the flow of his conversation with Arthur. I was dozing while waiting. Chris looked up and visually examined Big, who stood breathless and despairing before him. Arthur stopped strumming. I woke. Chris broke the silence. Good of you to join us. Arthur, what's wrong? I intervened. Chris, Big and I were discussing the story. You might want to see it. Not now, David. Can't you see he's upset? What is it, Big? You're my friends? Big began. I was feeling like Chris would never show an interest in the horror story I'd read. It had a major character called Webster. Big's issue distracted me. I never cared much for the ant farm. My younger sister liked those things. I had to admit, though, that he was really distressed. Joff was repeating everything that Big told Chris to both Chris and Arthur. They were despairing over ever getting revenge on the older boy. I asked aloud, what would Mrs. Webster do? And Arthur called out, that's it! Chris, we could spend the night at Mrs. Webster's house. Then we can really freak that boy out. Great idea, Arthur. Yeah, Arthur, joined in Joff. I wanted to say that I'd thought of it too. Chris gave instructions for us to invite each other over to his place for the evening. He would tell his parents that he was going to Arthur's house. We'd take our sleeping things and meet at Webster's old house. It had never been sold or leased since she had passed away that summer. Now it was high winter. She even had an old fireplace. We could roast marshmallows. The marshmallow image caught my imagination in ways that facing down an older boy didn't. My mum was happy for me to stay at Chris's place. His parents had a holiday place and she wanted access. She made sure I packed everything, like a toothbrush. I tried to explain to her that we weren't having that kind of a party, but I didn't want to alert her to what her greed had hidden. I also threw in the bag a neat flashlight I used to read under the covers, and a mirror I often used to examine myself. Sister helped me by distracting Mum with her helplessness. Mom, she cried, I'm thirsty. We met outside the gate. I was beginning to think that Big would never show at all, but we waited for him, as friends do. We were all shivering when he reached the gate. Joff had been staring at the windows, routinely claiming to see something. We kept pointing out the birds of winter that flew among the trees. It hadn't occurred to any of us that birds don't stay around frozen houses in winter, but then we still had some growing up to do. The gate creaked as it opened wide. In its disrepair, it had fallen forward slightly, and that made it easier to open, as we didn't have to push back the newly laid trackless snow. It was ankle high. The day's sun had left it crunchy on top, powdered below, so that the crunch of our steps and the creak of the gate announced our presence here to the world and made us jumpy. Chris was the first to the door. It was ajar. The lock had been broken by the police, never been fixed, so the door remained in an almost closed position. Now snow spilled into the entranceway and held the door in place. Arthur dragged his foot through the snow, soaking his ankle. I tried to bend down and scoop it with my gloved hands, but Joff's feet leapt forward and soon he too had soaked his feet and ankles. Chris had an amused expression on his face. When he widened the door and stepped inside, I got out my flashlight, but Chris said, it's light. We went in and were awed by the appearance. Before us were wide steps leading to the upper level. They were thick with dust. A shadowy shape on the top of the steps looked like a ghost. On our right was a dining room. The long table was as Mrs. Webster had left it, with now rotting fruit and places set two aside and one at the head. On our left was a lounge room. Two-person lounges and a single chair faced a fireplace. Ash spread from the fireplace into the room. The poker was lying next to the place, and a small fence protecting the place had been pushed aside. Lighting was provided courtesy of the candles in the room. 2 large wax candles were placed towards the middle ends of the table. In the living room were lit kerosene lamps placed along each wall. I said, "I don't like this. I want to go home." "It seems quite strange," echoed Joff. "We stay," said Chris. "We don't want to have our lives run by an older bully boy." I was thinking of saying that we weren't bullies, and so correcting his sentence, when Arthur said, "I think I heard something upstairs." Arthur was up the steps in a shot. Chris followed. Joff was wondering aloud where Big had gone. "Come on," I said, brandishing my flashlight. The steps were dusty, except where my friends had left their prints. At the top was a ghostly image. It was created by the outside lamps on the street shining through the uncurtained windows. "Look!" I called, pointing at the image. It looked for a moment as if it had a mouth that moved. That was an effect created by a bird outside, flying between the window and the street lamps. "Wow!" shot back Arthur. He was walking to the far side of the room, which in its time might have been a ballroom. I think our plan, if we would have had one, might have been to find the bedroom and hunker down for the evening, or to take the bedclothes to a fireplace and light some wood. It was a thin, reedy, but loud and inhuman scream that came from the cat that Arthur had stepped on. Meow! Chris wanted to know if we had heard the noise on the attic. "Pig and Joff seem to have left us," I say. Chris and Arthur ignored me as Arthur pulled on the rope that lowered the ladder to the attic. Soon I could hear their voices. "Look, we can place that mannequin in front of the window. It has her clothing. Great idea!" I went up the steps to investigate.